Faye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sadia. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here with me tonight. So a little bit of background about me before we dig into the castles themselves. My name's Faye. I grew up here in the Chicago area, and I first learned about castles in my high school French class. And then when I studied abroad in Bordeaux in the spring of 2015, I was able to visit a lot of them. France has a very nice train system, and so I was able to take the train to the Loire Valley, not too far away, and really see the beauty of the castles and the rich histories coming to life. Most of the castles you'll see today are owned by government bodies or heritage trusts. Only one of the ones we'll visit today is still occupied. That would be the one that I lived in. In the UK, there are official residences of the royal family like Buckingham Palace and Holyrood House. Those are not included in today's presentation. This presentation also favors castles rather than palaces. Now, the difference is that castles have things like fortifications, walls, defense mechanisms in case of attack. Only Lithgow of the ones we'll see today is a palace. So this is a layout. This particular one is a castle you'll see later, Amboise. So we have a bunch of different parts. We have the main castle, the residence, which is what we think of when we think of castles. But there's also, you can see in this map, there are a lot of different elements to it. There are usually lots and lots of gardens. You have towers for defense mainly. You have a little chapel here. You have an orangerie, which we'll talk about later. And so it can basically be like a whole mini city within this one castle environment. So here is a map with the yellow pins of the places that we'll see today. So I took several trips. Bordeaux is down here. That's where I lived for my study abroad. Up here, this is Loire Valley. So you'll see a number here. The first one is Azay-le-Rideau. And then the other ones I saw all in 1 week, one right after the other. Next, I went up to the UK and Ireland. So we'll see a couple in Scotland, a couple in Wales, and one in Ireland. Here is the one that I lived in, up here in Normandy. And then way down in Greece, right next to Turkey, we have the final castle that you'll see today. So here's a map of Loire Valley. This is where we're going to start. So you can see all these different little green points are the places that I visited. Now, the Loire is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's known for the beauty of its castles and its landscape. It has a hospitable climate because the river means that it's slightly warmer than you might otherwise expect. So that's very nice if you're looking for a place to put your castle. It's also known for its wines, mostly white wines. Sauvignon Blanc is a particular favorite. And it was actually known for having the best wines in England and France during the High Middle Ages. So in the spring of 2015, I did a little tour. I had my home base in Tours, and then I visited 2 or 3 castles each day, which you can see in these little points on the map. But first, we have Azay-le-Rideau, which I visited on Valentine's Day. So wow, almost 7 years ago. Next week was my first visit to this castle. So this looked like such a fairy tale castle when I first showed up to it. It's got this beautiful tree-lined path that you can see on either side. And this was the castle I got the most excited about in high school French class when we learned about the castles of the Loire, which are so exceptional as a group. So I convinced a friend to go with me on Valentine's Day during our study abroad. And this was the first castle I visited in France. So this is a side view, a little bit of history. The castle was built between 1518 and 1527. It's considered one of the best examples of the early French Renaissance. The current castle on this site was built by Gilles Berthelot, who was the mayor of Tours and treasurer general of King Francis I's finances. Then he had to flee the country, and it was given still unfinished to Francis's knight-at-arms Antoine Raffin. And then Raffin's granddaughter took over the castle in 1583 and modernized it. So these are some cool vines just on an outbuilding of the castle, because there are often a lot of really beautiful things that aren't part of the main castle building. The castle then remained in the Raffin family until 1787, when they sold it to the Marquis Charles de Biencourt, who, along with his son, did a great deal of restoration. And then the French state took over ownership of the castle in 1905. So here's a picture of me with the castle. You can see how much it dwarfs me. It's hard to get a good picture of a human and a castle, just proportion-wise. This is a salamander above the main castle door. A salamander was Francis I's symbol. So it was seen in a lot of castles, particularly in the Loire Valley, as they were being built at that time, because obviously you want to find favor with the king. In folklore and all sorts of stories, from Aristotle to the Talmud, salamanders are associated with fire, and they're often believed to either feed off of it or be renewed by it rather than being burnt up. The use of it as a royal symbol stems from the ability of the salamander to go through fire and come out the other side. However, this is a real salamander. Please don't try putting this little guy in the fire. He will die. So this is the first of many cool ceilings you'll see, because I like ceilings. This is a really cool vaulted ceiling. You can see this sort of crisscross structure here. We have a cherub in the center right panel, another salamander on the far right, and one in the center left. And then this one on the far left is an ermine, which is Francis I's wife Claude's symbol. So you'll see that a bunch as well. Next, Chateau d'Angers, the first castle that I saw on my big, grand, week-long tour of Loire castles. So the site was originally a Roman fortress. It was built on a slate spur in the Loire Valley in the historic region of Anjou. This castle was founded by the Counts of Anjou in the 9th century, and then it was taken over by the Plantagenet kings in the 12th century. It was then rebuilt by Louis IX, also called Saint-Louis, before he gave it to his brother, Charles I of Anjou. This castle features some of my favorite ramparts, which I'll explain in a minute, and also houses the Apocalypse Tapestry, which we'll see a little bit later. These are two different views of the castle itself. So Catherine de' Medici had it restored in 1562, but then her son Henry III took parts from the castle itself to develop the village of Angers around and outside the castle. It was also severely damaged during the Nazi occupation when an ammunition storage dump exploded, and then there was a fire in 2009 due to short circuiting. So this building has been through quite a lot in its history, and it was being rebuilt as I was there as well. So these are some great ramparts. Ramparts are defensive walls around castles or other constructions. They often have this sort of scallop shape that you can see here. It's called crenellation, or various types of holes in them in order to provide more defense. This one has this window-like hole that you can see in front. It was probably used for defense of the drawbridge, or in case an enemy got into the moat area. The drawbridge is just out of sight. I was standing on it when I took this picture. There are also gardens on top of these ramparts because they're not so much used for defense anymore in the 21st century. So this is a garden on top of the ramparts. I was there in April, so the vegetable garden hadn't gotten very far, but this was the start of it, along with more decorative elements and evergreens and things like that. So these are linden trees. They're also called lime trees in the UK and basswood here in the US, and they're called tilleul in French. The style is called pollarding, and it's really popular in France. I saw this all around the Loire as I traveled, and also a lot in Bordeaux. So just sort of a pretty common way to style trees there. This is in the moat. A moat is a trench around a castle or other fortified location used for defensive purposes, since they were difficult to cross, being giant trenches. Some, though not all, contained water at one point. They obviously don't really need the moat for its intended purposes anymore, so they have beautifully manicured gardens there instead. So we have these beautiful hedges and shrubbery and just the start of some floral elements there as well. Now, this is the Apocalypse tapestry. It's in a pretty dark room to protect it because it's very old and fragile at this point. It was commissioned by Louis I, Duke of Anjou, and it's the oldest surviving French medieval tapestry. It depicts the revelation of St. John as featured in the biblical book of Revelation. And so you can see different scenes from that book playing out in each of these panels here. So these are some chandeliers. I really love the combination of old and new here because you have these big, heavy iron structures meant to hold a torch or something. And then they are filled now with what amount to glow sticks. And so that contrast was really cool to see as well. Later that day, I went on to Saumur. It is owned by the city of Saumur. So I planned this trip without necessarily actually looking at what each castle looked like. I knew I would like all of them because they're castles. And so practical concerns like making sure that the trains lined up and that I was picking castles that were close-ish to each other was much more important to me. So I hadn't actually recently looked at a picture of this castle before I got there. And it was really familiar as I came across this bridge. And it turned out that I had seen this castle in my French textbook in high school as well. We were learning about the Trérugère du Duc de Berry, which was an illuminated book of hours from the 1400s. A book of hours is a collection of prayers to be said at certain times of day. And in this case, it's also illustrated, which is what illuminated means. So this is September in that collection. You can see here on the right. I had this strong sense of recognition because you can see this is this exact same castle, and it was really cool to see something like that come to life, even though it looks like sort of a fairy tale fantasy element in the Book of Hours. Here's a really pretty view of the castle. I always think that this one, like Azé, looks kind of like a fairy tale. It was originally built by Theobald I, Count of Blois, and then rebuilt by Henry II of England in the later 12th century. It was passed around for a while, and then it became army barracks in 1621, and then a state prison under Napoleon. The city of Saumur acquired it at the beginning of the 20th century, as was fairly common. So these are a couple fleur-de-lis elements. This was formerly part of the floor tiling, but because it's older now and fragile, it is behind glass. So the fleur-de-lis was the former royal arms of France. It's meant to be a stylized lily, and you might recognize it from the flag of Quebec. So here are more cool ceilings. They often have this arched vaulted style for support, and then they also often have either faces like this one on the left or foliage like the one on the right as sort of decorative elements, or sometimes they had more meaning. So the first castle that I saw on the second day of my trip was Clos-Lucé. It is owned by the Saint-Brie family. You'll notice that most of the castles have the same name as the town. This one doesn't because there's already a Chateau d'Amboise, so the second castle in the city had to have a different name. So this castle and Amboise are actually connected by an underground tunnel. This one was built in 1471. It's where Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519. Now, he and Francis I were probably involved, and Francis lived at Amboise at the time. So Francis gave da Vinci this mansion so that they could live close together. After the Saint-Brie family bought it in 1855, they turned it into a museum about da Vinci's life, and then it opened to the public in 1954. So this is a full-size model on the right of a machine gun. Da Vinci created a lot of different designs of things, and a lot of those were weapons of war of various kinds. So scattered around the grounds were full-size imaginings of what these drawings would be like, and then there were smaller models inside the castle. So this is a spinning rolling machine gun, and you can actually walk inside and use the little wheel to spin it around, which is quite a surreal experience. And then this is a 10-barreled machine gun. Again, up in the top right, we have the smaller model, and then a full-size model on the grounds on the left. This is another less violent design of Da Vinci's. It's a two-tiered bridge. So you see you would walk in on the bottom, and then there is a little spiral staircase going up to the top, and then you can walk all the way out to either side there. So this was also just on the grounds. They built a whole lot of his inventions and just sort of scattered them around to be discovered. Next, Amboise, the other castle, and just a 5-minute walk down the road from Clos-Lucé. So this is a view of it from the outside further down in the valley. The origins of this castle date back to the late 9th century, and it was a strategic location throughout various wars. It was seized by Charles VII of France in 1434, which, as you'll hear later, was quite bad news for his grandson, Charles VIII. This is the facade. You might recognize the shape. This is from the little castle map that we saw earlier on. Charles VIII, the grandson of the aforementioned Charles VII, did extensive rebuilding of this castle. Additionally, his cousin's cousin Francis I was raised in the castle and then stayed there during the beginning of his leadership. Henry II and Catherine de' Medici raised their children, including Francis II and also Mary, Queen of Scots, at Amboise as well. The castle fell out of royal favor during the French Wars of Religion due to the excess of murders and the resulting smell. The Count of Paris now maintains the castle using the Saint-Louis Foundation. So again, we have this high vaulted ceiling on the right. This is Charles VIII on the left. This is a nice high vaulted ceiling. Not all of them are like that. At one point, Charles walked through a doorway in Amboise, hit his head, and subsequently died from his injury after having been ill. So not such good luck for him. So these are windows. These are up on the top floor, and this is some just gorgeous detailing on the outside borders of them. And I took this picture leaning out of a turret, and so these are not really on display, but they're still really beautifully decorated, and that's sort of a very common element of castles. So this is the top of this giant spiral ramp. It's actually large enough to drive carriages directly up, horses and all. This is so that any nobles or visitors who were probably wearing very fancy clothes didn't have to walk very far and didn't have to get their clothes in the mud or anything like that. Now, this is part of the sculptural element above the entrance to the chapel, which is Chapelle Saint-Hubert. There you can see there's a stag here in the middle, there's a knight, there's lots of dogs, and that Saint-Hubert was the patron saint of hunters, hence this particular hunting scene. Leonardo da Vinci is now likely interred in this chapel after the original chapel where he was buried was demolished by Napoleon. My third castle that day, because I got to see 3 castles in one day, was Chenonceau. So you'll notice that this has the same name, but is spelled a little differently as compared to the town. So Louise Dupin de Francois owned the castle during the French Revolution. Because it was given to Diane de Poitiers in the 1500s, it was not owned by the crown, and Dupin really wanted to emphasize that difference in order to save it from the revolution, which was not super fond of the monarchy. She also had salons at Chenonceau, and writers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau were part of her circle. And now it is owned by the Meunier family. So this castle is known for 2 things, its gardens and its huge hall, which was built in additions. And that might be kind of surprising given this view, where it looks fairly small for a castle, not something with an overly gigantic hall. And that is because the hall is actually built out over the river, and it's not built quite to the other side, but it's pretty close. People actually kayak through these arches. The bridge itself, just the lowest element here, was built by Diane de Poitiers, and then the gallery was added by Catherine de Medici. So this is the gallery, just looking straight down the hall. It has various artwork and things throughout the hall. The other floor has a whole lot more art. This floor has great views of the river and also a bit of the gardens as well. So this is one of the more beautiful garden spaces. You can see in the middle, there's this little bubbly fountain and a lot of manicured lawn space. The gardens began in earnest under Diane de Poitiers' time at the castle, after it was given to her by Henry II as she was his mistress. In French court, there was often an official mistress, so it wasn't nearly as scandalous affair it might have been in English court or nowadays. However, Queen Catherine de Medici did not like Diane, so after Henry's death, Catherine forced Diane out and took up residence in the castle, and then she actually added on more gardens. So this is a very tiny poulailler tree and a vine-covered dovecote on the right. A dovecote is housing for pigeons or doves. They were kept for food, eggs, and dung in the Middle Ages, and we'll see an example of what the inside of one looks like when we get to Chinon. This is a giant field of tulips. I was standing about halfway through the field when I took this picture. So there's this, another half behind me, and an equally long set of tulips on the other side. So there were just a whole lot of these flowers all at once. Next, we have Langeais. This is Langeais Castle, sort of the back of it from the top of the ruins of the previous castle. There's construction because these are old buildings, so you can see that being maintained there on the left. There was a full multimedia production in one of the rooms, and it explained the history of the castle, complete with lifelike figurines. It is considered to be an exceptional example of late medieval architecture, and it was built in 1465 under Louis XI. Jacques Siegfried bought it in 1886, restored it, and then gave it to the Institut de France, which currently owns it. These are the ruins. This is where I was standing when I took the previous picture. And it's what remains of the previous castle, which was built in 992 by Odo I, Count of Blois. If you are a Star Trek fan, that is spelled the same as the character Odo, but no relation, I don't think. This was the keep, or the fortified tower, and it was fortified and expanded under Richard the Lionheart, but then recaptured by King Philippe II of France in 1206 and destroyed by the English during the 100 Years' War. And it is, as I mentioned, on the grounds of the current castle. Next, we have Chinon. It is owned by the Indre-et-Loire General Council. It's also called the Forteresse Royale de Chinon, so the Royal Fortress of Chinon. This is a view into the entrance across a bridge. It was originally really heavily guarded. You can see these slit windows here would have originally been good for defense because it's very easy to aim a bow and arrow out, but very hard for any projectiles to come back in. This is also an example of where machicolations were used. These holes, in this case positioned around the top of the clock tower here, allowed for defense of the castle by dropping rocks, fire, or boiling liquid on attackers, which you can imagine would be a very unpleasant surprise if you're in the midst of storming a castle. There are lots of images of Joan of Arc coming across this bridge as well. So we have on the left a tapestry of her entering across that very bridge, and then a painting of her on the right. This is a castle with the strongest claim on Joan of Arc, although a lot of castles in Loire, if they can have any history with her, they will. Joan of Arc claimed to have had visions of various Christian figures telling her to support Charles VII in the 100 Years' War. She's best known for having been part of the siege of Orléans, helping to win it and boost morale, leading to victory. So this is the main castle. It's a little bit less impressive from the outside compared to some of the others, but inside there is a full multimedia experience, and it's definitely the most impressive in that regard. There's a huge focus on Joan of Arc because, like I said, they're very proud to claim her, and the exhibits are interactive as well. So it's a full experience there. There's some lovely fields outside the castle. These are great fields, and this area is known for their Cabernet Franc red wines. Personally, I thought this was one of the prettiest areas I visited. The castle is surrounded on 3 sides by these great fields, and on the 4th side by the river. So this is the inside of a dovecote. We saw the outside of one at Chenonceau. This is the inside, and as you can see, there are literally pigeonholes where they could make their nests, and then different items could be collected. Later that day, I saw Loches. It is owned by the city of Loches. So Joan of Arc came back to Loches after the English siege at Orléans to convince Charles VII to go to Reims to be crowned. So, of course, that's a really important element in history as well. These are the royal lodgings, so you can see a little bit smaller, but still a lot of different rooms here for the different royalty to stay in. This is the dungeon tower. This castle is particularly known for its dungeons. It was built by the Count of Anjou. It was a military fortress and then used as a state prison by Louis XI, who you'll remember had Langeais built. He grew up at Loches, but he actually preferred Amboise. So just imagine deciding that your childhood home was better suited to being a prison. It was used as such through the beginning of the 19th century. So this is the spiral part of the dungeon. You can see there's this sort of rectangular spiral going down to the bottom. Because I was visiting in April, it was not peak tourist season, so I had a lot of these places mostly to myself, and it's pretty eerie to be in there alone in this place, this prison with so much history. There would have been mostly political prisons in here during its time as a state prison. Ludwiko Sforza, Duke of Milan, was a notable prisoner, and he was given painting supplies and a heated cell, and he painted the walls and ceiling of that cell. There's also a so-called graffiti room, which has all sorts of symbols and coats of arms and names etched into the walls. And so seeing all this really helps you imagine the people who must have spent time there over the centuries for one reason or another. Displays like this added to the general creepiness of the atmosphere. This prisoner was animated, and so he would move around when you weren't expecting it. He also had a soundtrack, so it was quite evocative. And this is a little sign outside the tourist bureau. It says, "I loche you." Next, we have Chateau de Blois, which is owned by the city of Blois. Now, this castle surprised me because I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I had just sort of tacked it on at the end because I couldn't get to Chambord, and they share a train stop. And then it was this gorgeous palatial castle. The Counts of Blois originally had a castle at this location, and then the current one was built starting from the 13th century. This is the other side. You can see this facade has a totally different character from the other part. The red part is the Louis XII wing. He made Blois his favorite royal residence, and the figure on horseback over the entrance on the left is him. I loved this staircase. I spent a lot of time staring up at it and trying to get the perfect photo with my camera that was less than up to the task. A fun fact about staircases, speaking of Chambord, which was the one that I couldn't get to, if you've heard of the double helix staircase that is located at Chambord, and it was created so that the wife and the mistress could each have their own staircase and not have to pass each other on the stairs. This is a lovely fireplace. You can see it's really richly painted and gilded, and it's in the largest remaining civilian Gothic room. Once again, we see Francis I's salamanders. Francis I also created one of the most important libraries of his period at Blois. which is, very special to me personally because I am a librarian. It was moved to Fontainebleau because Francis didn't spend very much time at Blois. This is a lovely ceiling with a variety of crests painted onto it. And you can see, again, it's pretty richly painted and it has more crests altogether than you would normally see. So next we're going to hop up to UK and Ireland. So we have Edinburgh and Linlithgow up here in Scotland, Cardiff Castle and Castell Coch here in Wales, and then Drinna and Malahide Castle, and we'll see Malahide at the end. First up, we have Edinburgh Castle. This was after I finished my study abroad. I was able to travel around the UK and Ireland for a little over 3 weeks. And of course, I saw as many castles as I could during that time. So this is a view of Edinburgh Castle from a hill across town. That hill has actually been occupied in one way or another since late Bronze Age, so maybe somewhere around 3000 BCE. It became a royal seat during the time of King Malcolm III in the mid to late 1000s CE, and the current castle started being built in the 1100s. It was the site of important battles during the Wars of Scottish Independence, and it has been under siege 26 times in its history, making it the most besieged place in Great Britain and one of the most attacked in the world. Here's a closer view. You can actually see down at the bottom left some of that volcanic rock that it's built on. So starting with Charles II's restoration in 1660 up until 1923, a garrison of soldiers was kept at the castle, and it was also turned into a prison during some of that time. The Historic Scotland organization took over caring for the castle when it was established in 1991, and then passed it along to its successor, Historic Environment Scotland. This is Mons Meg, a cannon that is over 500 years old, but last fired in 1681. Mons Meg is now a little bit fragile to be fired, but it's there on display, and you can see some of those giant cannonballs down at the bottom right. There are, however, cannon blasts from the 1 o'clock gun every day at guess what time. There was also, just by happenstance, on the day I visited, an additional blast because it was Victory in Europe Day, which was the day of Nazi Germany's surrender to the Allies in World War II. So we have the crest, and there's sort of a lot going on here. This is the Royal Arms of Scotland under James VI after 1603. So we have on the left a unicorn for Scotland, because if you could choose a national animal, why would you not choose a unicorn? The lion for England, the respective flags above them, and then this Latin says King James I of Britain, France, and Ireland. Next, we have Linlithgow. It is sort of in between Edinburgh and Glasgow. I passed through on my way to Glasgow. And it is owned by Historic Environment Scotland as well. So these are some gorgeous palace ruins. This is the one palace we'll see today. And I really love ruins, so this is wonderful as well. It was burned by the Duke of Cumberland's army in 1746 as he was attempting to put down an attempt by the Stuarts to gain control of the country. The Stuarts were a royal family that included Mary Queen of Scots, who was born at Linlithgow. The house was trying to take back over the throne after having been ousted by the Hanovers in 1714. For context, Victoria was a Hanover, so you can sort of see how that went for the Stuarts ultimately. So here are more ramparts. There were no signs saying I couldn't walk across these narrow little bridges, and so I did, and it was lots of fun. This is a humanoid gargoyle type thing. It's also a functional one. You can see the little water spout coming out of its mouth. So in addition to being a sort of odd humanoid, it also serves an actual purpose. So here are two burned out halls. You can see the grand fireplace at the end of the one on the left. The current ruins were built by King James I of Scotland, not to be confused with James VI and I of Scotland in England, in the 1420s as a royal residence. And then the royal family used it on and off for the next couple of centuries, rebuilding various parts as they collapsed or burnt. And here is a little lion with a shield with little crest on it. Next, we're going down to Wales. We're going to Cardiff Castle, which is owned by the city of Cardiff. This is the facade of the building itself, and there is so much cool history here. The site started off as a defensive Roman location. The third Marquess of Bute did a lot of redecorating in the late 19th century with the help of William Burgess. It was used as a shelter in World War II, and it even housed the National College of Music and Drama for 25 years in the 1900s. Here are some more lovely ceilings. So these were heavily gilded with rich paints over every inch. And the photos don't even necessarily do them justice. It, to me, felt like fudge. It's so rich that you can only have, or it's so rich that you can only have a little at one time. Otherwise, it's overwhelming and you need to look at a blank white wall for a little while. But it was really incredibly beautiful. So this is a ceiling, again, just in a hallway, but as you can see, really richly decorated and gilded and heavy paints and things like that. This is a lovely ornate fireplace with various heraldic symbols. We don't have time to go over all of the heraldry symbols, but if you are into heraldry, this is a good thing to examine. So here are two views. You can see that it's right in the middle of town. And I took the picture on the left partway through climbing the tower on the right. You can see just directly ahead in the middle, that's Principality Stadium, which is home of the Cardiff Blues rugby team. So you can see it really is right in the center of town, and the contrast with the very old buildings with the hyper modern ones. The older castle tower on the right is a Norman keep, possibly built by William the Conqueror. The castle passed through many hands and weathered a variety of battles. In 1766, the first Marquess of Bute acquired it and started extensive renovations in 1776. His grandson, the second Marquess, and great-grandson, the third Marquess, were responsible for a great deal of changes to the castle. And after the death of the fourth Marquess, the castle was given to the city of Cardiff. Next, our other castle in Wales is Castell Coch, which is owned by Cadw, the Welsh Heritage Agency. Sorry about that. So we have Castell Coch. It means red castle in Welsh for obvious reasons. It's outside of Cardiff in a sort of suburb called Tonglais, and it's easily accessible by bus. The third Marquess of Bute made it his retreat, although he didn't actually end up using it that much, because who doesn't have a spare castle sort of lying around redecorated for whenever the fancy strikes? It has some of the same features as Cardiff Castle, but it's much more of a ruin and a much smaller building overall. This is a 13th century castle. The ruins were acquired by the Bute family in 1760, so that was the father of the first Marquess who bought the Cardiff Castle. William Burgess redid it for the third Marquess of Bute in a mock medieval style, so he's the same person who redid Cardiff Castle, and that's why you'll see a lot of similar elements there. There is one room that is painted all around with animals from Aesop's fables. So these are a couple of the examples that you'll see. We have the cats and the cheese up in the top left. The cats are fighting over which one gets the bigger slice of cheese, and the monkey keeps cutting off pieces of the larger one until he has eaten all the cheese and the cats haven't gotten any. In the bottom right, you'll see the peacock and the magpie. The birds are choosing a leader, and they choose the clever magpie over the beautiful peacock. Next, moving over to Ireland, we have Drinna Castle. This is owned by Antisha, the National Trust for Ireland. So it's a really pretty castle, and it's a bit of a hidden gem. Even my friend from Dublin didn't know about it, and Drinna is a suburb of Dublin. It's an early 15th century Norman castle that's been used for various purposes over the years. This is the moat. It's actually the last castle in Ireland with a flooded moat, so it's pretty special in that way. And there's this lovely bridge going over it. This is a garden area with manicured hedges, and it had a fairly extensive herb and vegetable garden as well. And you can see this is another view. You have these beautiful triangular hedges and these pretty little shrubs as well. So next, we're going back to France in Normandy this time. So this is Chateau d'Acquigny. This is the one that I lived in, and it is owned by the Baron d'Enval. So unlike other French castles I visited, this one is in Normandy. And a rule of thumb is that Norman things in France have a lot more in common with Norman things in England than with other French things. As a general rule, Normans are Norman first and French second, almost like Texan. So you can see this little yellow pinpoint here. It is just northwest of Paris, a little bit north of Évreux, situated right around here. So this is the facade of the castle. You notice that's the one behind me as well. The original castle there was the fortress of Acquigny, built by William the Conqueror in 1040, and then it was ordered destroyed by Charles V of France in 1378. This Renaissance chateau was built in 1557 by Anne de Laval for her husband, Louis de Silly, that's S-I-L-L-Y. It actually has two rivers flowing through the grounds, which makes it a little unusual. We have the Eure and the Iton. So it actually housed both sets of troops in World War II. And it's been owned by the Baron d'Enval since the 1700s. That's who I lived with there. Baron is a noble title, lower than a viscount, but above a knighthood, and it dates back to the Middle Ages. The French made a pretty strong departure from nobility during the Revolution, of course, so the barony fiefdoms were no longer in play after that time. And then after Napoleon, all of the feudal implications were removed, such that Baron is now more or less an honorary title without any particular associated privileges. Bertrand and Agnès are essentially full-time custodians of their property, which includes the castle and its grounds, along with various farmland around the country. This is the back of the castle. This room right here was my room, just up on the third floor there. And I had the floor to myself for almost the entire time that I was there, which was pretty surreal to be living on one floor of a castle without anybody else. So this is the orangerie. This is where orange trees and other more delicate tropical plants were kept during the winter to protect them. It's now used as an event venue, and I went to a fundraiser event there that was extremely fancy and intimidating. So that is sort of the modern use is for a variety of events. There's a lot of garden area on these castle grounds. Because of the two rivers, there are lots of water elements. This is a tiny little waterfall here and a little pond. So this is the vegetable garden, the potager. There were many different types of fruits and vegetables. You can see the vines here along the walls, both on the top and the bottom. And in my hand here, these are white gooseberries. They're both tart and grape-like, and I'd never had them before going to live at the castle. So that's some very fun memory there. Here's me at the castle with my little stand set up to take entrance fees and things like that. So the doors and windows were pretty much all like this, and we had to open most of them at the beginning and end of every day. And so you have these bars across them, both on the top and the bottom, with these little hooks here. So you have to take the heavy bar out without pinching your fingers or hitting any of the delicate things on either side, and then open the door from there. So that was always a fun challenge. And on the right, there's a lovely little door handle. So these are a couple of Norman pieces. They had a variety of pieces of glasswork and ceramic work. On the right in particular, this is typical Norman ceramic work. You can see with that detailing, that particular color blue are very typically Norman. This is another view of the castle across the grounds from a different angle this time. So this is the bookshelf I primarily worked on. I got to create my own cataloging system and document them, and I also did basic cleaning and maintenance on them as far as I was able. Many of the shelves were 2 books deep, and most of the books were either old or personalized or both. Books used to be much rarer and more expensive, and they were often illustrated as well. And by personalized, I mean that they say something like imprint for 51, printed for the Baron d'Enval, and that the person in question would have been the grandfather of the current Baron. Some of these books were hundreds of years old. I think the oldest ones were for the 13 or 1400s. So for a librarian, this was kind of a dream. So these are a couple examples of the printing in some of the books. The page on the left translated says, the artisan Louis Joux created this book as much for his pleasure as for yours. He printed it in Paris on May 15th, 1927. If it is to your taste, all is well for him and for you. If not, peace and to each his own. So a little bit of snark there. And then the page on the right is the title page of a 1776 book called The Perverted Peasant, or The Dangers of the City, a recent history updated according to real letters from the characters. So you can imagine the intrigue that must be in this book. These are examples of some of the covers of books. You can see there's a great deal of intricacy, and these all would have been done by hand. The current Baron's grandfather had a particular interest in books, and some of these covers were done by him. He also had a lot of them that were customized for him. So you can see the middle one. This is inlaid gilding, and so all of the little pieces would have been cut out and then gilded back in. And then on the 2 sides, we have leather work, and again, the holes would have been punched out or the little lines scored for the gilding, and then a different color of leather and the gilding put back in. These are some inside covers. The first 2 on the left and the middle are examples of the stitched inside covers of some of the books, and the last one is a painted peacock feather design. This collection of books is called Monseigneur Levin. I got very excited when I saw it because I don't know if you remember, but half of my last name is Levin, and I was so excited. I thought, wow, this is such an unusual name in France. Turns out it is a set of books about wine, le vin, 2 words, just not spaced out on the books. So that was a disappointing experience. This is a lovely preserved piece of the stained glass that used to be in all of the windows. When they replaced the windows, they saved a few pieces, and so this is one of them. This was displayed on the bookshelf in front of books and on a high enough shelf that I had to climb up on a rickety ladder to reach it and bring it down so that I could access the books behind it. I was very scared that I was going to drop it or hurt it in some way, this stained glass that was like hundreds of years old, and that the Baroness was just going to kick me out of the house and that would be it. Don't worry, it was fine. Nobody even noticed the new cracks in it. So next, I didn't travel for a while. I finished up school. I went to work in Martinique in the Caribbean. And then I went to Greece, and one of my stops in Greece was at Mytilene Castle. So for reference, Athens is down here in the south of Greece. Mytilene is up here. And you can see this is Turkey right next to Mytilene, but the island itself is officially part of Greece and has been since 1912, when it started being used as a military barracks. I took a 12-hour overnight ferry down from the port of Athens between these islands and over to Mytilene, with a stop or 2 on the way for other islands. So these are 2 views of the castle. As you can see, it's in ruins. Mytilene is an island in the Aegean Sea. It's also known as Lesbos, and is where the poet Sappho was from. That's where we get the words lesbian and sapphic. The castle is in ruins, which I love, and it was amazing because, again, the time of year that I was there was not a popular tourist time, and so I had it entirely to myself for a few hours. This is a view out over the sea in different directions on a clear day. You can easily see Turkey. There have been a number of different castle and fort arrangements on this site, dating all the way back to classical times. The city itself has been organized since 1254 BCE, and the castle area was probably originally the site of an acropolis, which were often fortified settlements with a defensive and religious purpose. It appears that the original acropolis here may have been dedicated to Demeter, who is the goddess of agriculture, Persephone, her daughter, and Cybele, an Anatolian mother goddess. So this is part of the castle that is still standing, and I was able to climb up on it a bit, and you can see the lovely Greek flag up top. The current fortifications were built in Byzantine times, somewhere in the first 1,000 years CE, and the first major modifications were made in 1373 after Francisco Gattaluzzo took it as a dowry. It was then destroyed in an earthquake in 1384, just 11 years later, killing everyone in the royal family and destroying the castle. So these are some more pretty ruins. The castle was then captured by the Turks in 1462, and it continued to be built upon over the centuries, most notably in 1677 by the Ottomans, who built some of this part with the little arched style there. The fortress is actually being excavated currently by the Canadian Archaeological Institute, which has found artifacts from a wide variety of times and cultures there. So we are still learning more about what went on in this castle and all of the different people who would have once been there. These are the catacombs. This is an underground section, once would have been a burial area. Remember how I had the place all to myself? That included these dark underground spaces, and I'm not saying I'm afraid of ancient Greek ghosts, but it's possible I may have run out of there the first creek the first couple times I went down there. So now we have a little bit, another little bit of a time jump. So this is most recently in August 2019. I went to Ireland for a science fiction convention and vacation. And I ended up taking a bus up to Malahide Castle on my last day. It was so much the last thing I did that I took the bus directly to the airport from the castle. So this castle, as I mentioned, is just north of Dublin. You can get there on the regular city buses. It was owned by the Talbot family from 1185 to 1976, except for 11 years when Cromwell gave the land to someone who was later beheaded, at which point it reverted back to the Talbots. As you've heard from other castles, it's pretty unusual for one family to end up having a castle this long between conquering and sales and beheadings and things, even among royalty, which the Talbots were not. Rose Talbot finally sold it to the Irish state when her brother Milo, the seventh and final Baron, died, and she went off to live on the family estate in Tasmania to be a sheep farmer, and she died in 2009. As I was wandering the grounds, I suddenly saw a random peacock pictured on the left here. There was no mention of them in the literature or anything, and I didn't see any others. This one was just there because sometimes there are random peafowl. And on the right, we have a pretty little glass greenhouse. It was really a very tiny building. Between most of the other castles and this one, I learned to take selfies. So I actually have pictures of myself with this castle, unlike most of the others. That's the main castle on the left. On the right, this is a tiny door. It was a small building that looked like it was probably a shed of some kind at one point. That is a 5'4" human for reference, so really a quite small door. This is some really lovely molding up near the ceiling, and then the walls themselves, the orange paint is called Malahide orange because it's so closely associated with this particular castle. It's from the 19th century and it's this lovely terracotta color. It might be really obvious who this is, but actually this is not George Washington. We were told very specifically on the tour that this was not George Washington because apparently a lot of Americans think it is. It's actually Murroch O'Brien, the first Marquis of Thomond, who lived from 1726 to 1808. So he was actually a pretty good parallel to Washington, who lived from 1732 to 1799. This is a bridge behind the castle. These were really very pretty grounds and extremely expansive. The forest behind the bridge goes on for quite a ways, and most of it is open to the public. So a lot of people use it just as a general park area. This bridge was on the West Lawn, the area where they had the ferry trail, which was a series of little houses and travel stations and tributes to the ferries, which was really quite lovely and adorable. And this is another view of the castle, and that is the end. So I'm seeing in the chat some questions.
Actually, there are more comments, and there was one question: are we going to see anything from in Germany, castles of Germany?
Well, I would love to. These are all castles I've been to. In terms of castles in Germany, I've been to Schliesheim Castle. That was actually the first castle I ever visited. It's just a very small ruin near where my cousins live, and I've been to Heidelberg Castle. So unfortunately 2 is not enough for a presentation, but I would love to do that someday when I can travel again.
Okay, well, is there any other questions from anybody? I mean, thank you so much, Faye. That was so amazing. All the pictures with all the facts behind it. That was great. Very informative too. Really nice to watch. Let's see, we've got some.
Thank you. So thank you, Sarah. There are castles in Eastern Europe. I have not been to any, but they certainly exist. Thank you, Christine. Darlene, there were some photography restrictions. I think in particular, Chinon didn't really want you taking pictures of the dynamic exhibits, and there were certainly areas where they didn't want you to take pictures for various, a lot of preservation reasons, and things like that. Thank you, Karen. Are there any other questions? And thank you, Jane. I don't think I said that.
I think everyone really appreciated it. Thank you again, Faye. And thank
you for hosting me. And
oh no, it was our pleasure. Thank you everyone for joining tonight. Again, it was recorded, so if you want to rewatch the amazing pictures, you can watch it on our YouTube channel. All right, everybody. Have a great.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Sadia.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.